The Australian Financial Review.
It's been a huge 2 weeks in Canberra. The best and brightest met with Treasurer Jim Chalmers to solve Australia's productivity problem.
Business leaders, union chiefs and bureaucrats were locked in the Cabinet room this week, debating how to lift Australia's flagging productivity.
The government finally made the decision to rein in the ballooning National Disability Insurance Scheme and try and get the budget back on track.
The greatest generational inequality we're bequeathing is this debt bomb that, every newborn kid is going to inherit, from the moment they take their first breath.
And ASIO revealed Iran was responsible for 2 anti-Semitic arson attacks in Australia, prompting the first post-war expulsion of an ambassador.
Iran's representative given a week to get out over revelations the rogue nation directed 2 anti-Semitic firebombing attacks on our country.
Welcome to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray. This week, political editor Phillip Coorey on the debt bomb facing the next generation, the Braveheart situation in Parliament, and the Iran-led attacks on Australian soil. It's Thursday, August 28. Hi, Phil. Thanks for coming back on the podcast.
No worries, Lise. Glad to be back.
The last time we spoke was just over 3 months ago. Labor had just had a thumping win over the coalition in the election. They won 94 of the 150 seats in the House of Representatives. What does that look like close up? What's it like now in Parliament House?
It looks stark. I think the best descriptor came from Michael McCormack, the Nationals MP. A few weeks ago when Parliament first sat, Michael said, and he walked in, looked across the chamber, he felt like that scene out of Braveheart, where the peasants were standing there with their rakes and shovels facing, the might of the English army, ranged against them on the hill across the valley. Just the imbalance.
If you make enemies on both sides of the border, you'll end up dead.
We all end up dead. It's just a question of how and why.
We wrote about it a lot after the election, but there's nothing like seeing it for the first time. All the Liberal and Coalition MPs sort of huddled down one end and then a slightly reduced crossbench in the middle and then Labor MPs spilling across the aisle. We haven't had a government with 94 seats in the House of Representatives since John Howard.
His majority in the first Howard government will be somewhere, it would seem, between 44 and 48 seats.
In 1996, a landslide against Paul Keating.
And I commit myself and my future government to the service of all of the Australian people. Thank you.
But the difference between 96 and now is there was a possibility back then that Labor could win the next election. I think this is the first time in a long time most people are of the view that there's no way the coalition can win the next election. They're on 43 seats. They would have to win 32 plus in one fell swoop. Now, you never say never anymore because politics has gone crazy. So we're looking at a parliament which nearly everyone agrees the Albanese government will run for another 6 years. And that does feed into the mindset and into the morale of both sides.
So last week we had the Economic Reform Roundtable. Was it just a talk fest, Phil? There was a lot of criticism that it was. Do you think some of the ideas will be taken seriously and they might become real policies?
The problem with last week, in a real sense, is there wasn't one single thing said in that week that's not been said time and again over the months and years preceding it. So did it advance anything new? I would say it didn't. The reason the government did it, this was really a softening up exercise.
Well, the first day of this roundtable is all about resilience, how Australia can day 2 of this 3-day summit, and today it's been all about boosting lagging productivity, or as the government calls it,
this morning's session on this fund day has been focused on budget sustainability and tax reform.
To sort of hang a lantern over this problem called productivity, let the public know that there's this serious problem, try and explain what productivity actually is. It's basically output. It's how much you churn out in return for the hours you spend at your desk, and get all these serious and important people in a room to concur in solemn tones that we need to do something and we can't wait. So it's really about just trying to generate momentum that they didn't seek at the last election to do something. Now that As they are telling us, it was 3 days to inform 3 budgets. So I think the really contentious stuff, trusts or capital gains tax exemptions or any of these so-called wealth taxes, at this stage they have a mind to take it to the next election seeking a mandate. So productivity is just through the floor. It's the lowest it's been in 60 years. It's been declining rapidly for quite a while now under governments of both persuasions. There's many reasons why our productivity has declined. We've seen a big drop-off in business investment due to the cost of doing business and red tape, energy prices through the roof. That's a consequence of not having a settled energy policy because of the climate wars that have crippled the parliament for so long. We've been slow to adopt technology. And, one of the big moves is there's a huge shift towards the service sector. When you set up things like the NDIS and big subsidies for childcare and stuff, those sectors take a lot of workers from more productive areas of the economy. It's an economic thing called the Baumhole effect. It's actually got a name.
And Phil, who did the government bring together to try and solve this productivity problem?
So the attendees, it was the usual suspects at the summit. It was the peak business and employer organisations like the Business Council, the industry group, ACCI. Then you had the welfare sector, ACOS, the trade unions were there through the ACTU. You had Ken Henry because he authored the Henry Tax Review, which has been now ignored for 15 years. A few economists like Chris Richardson and Bob Brunig who are the sort of the voices of reason, if you like, on government spending. Then you had Allegra Spender. She got the gig for the Teals because she's made tax reform her shtick since she's been in Parliament, so she got rewarded with a seat. So it was that sort of usual suspects. The summit was divided into 3 days. I think it was the last day was the interesting day because that was tax reform and budget sustainability, and that's the one that people sit up and take notice about because that's the one that's going to have a direct and immediate implications on everybody. The other two were, there was a day on red tape and discussions on artificial intelligence. That was discussed a lot too.
And inside and outside the summit, Phil, there was a lot of talk about budget repair. The government has started to make changes to the National Disability Insurance Scheme and the pension system to try and rein in spending. How much trouble is the budget in, and is the government doing enough?
Look, the budget's in massive trouble, Lisa, notwithstanding that in the next few weeks we'll get the budget deficit number for the financial year just gone, and it's going to be a lot less than we thought it was. Back in March, I think the forecast was 20-something billion, and now the Treasurer is saying it'll come in at about 10 or 11. But it'll still be a deficit. We're still in deficit for the next 10 years, and more importantly, the debt is getting worse. The debt is going to push through $1 trillion very soon. And when you talk about generational inequality, the greatest generational inequality we're bequeathing is this debt bomb that, every newborn kid is going to inherit from the moment they take their first breath. And we're not just talking federal government. State governments are worse. They're far more irresponsible. I think if you're born in the ACT today, you immediately owe $47,000. Victoria's even worse. So the budget's in trouble. The 5 big pressures on the budget, health, aged care, defence, interest payments on debt, and the NDIS. And the NDIS is just eating the budget alive. It is the most well-intentioned but worst designed policy, I would argue, in Australia's history. And the big news last week didn't happen in the round table. The big news last week was Mark Butler standing up at the press club.
We are at a fork in the road right now, I really sincerely believe.
And saying 2 years ago the states and the Commonwealth agreed to reduce the growth rate of the NDIS to 8%. Well, guess what? It's still going to explode. We've got to get it down to 5 or 6.
We have to make sure that we shake up this system and get that sort of discipline and integrity into it that will deliver maximum value for people with a disability as well as for taxpayers.
So how are they going to rein in spending for the NDIS?
The first mechanism is to divert off the NDIS and onto a new scheme called Thriving Kids. Kids basically under 9 who have very mild disorders, mild autism, and it's going to start next year.
Diverting this group of kids over time from the NDIS is an important element of making the scheme sustainable and returning it to its original intent.
Now, before the NDIS existed, those kids, they sort of got support through the school system or the states provided at a community or a school level. But once the NDIS came along, Lisa, the problem was in the design. The Gillard government was so keen to get this thing up and running and get the states on board that they basically just said, look, you dump everything on that, we'll make it work. And the state said, of course. Well, as a couple of years ago, it was growing at 22%, right, a year. So that's why the Commonwealth, was just pulling its hair out saying it's sending us broke. The NDIS was was intended to care for the permanently and significantly disabled, right? So if you were born with a severe disability or you had the misfortune in life to have a catastrophic accident or a brain injury, it was only meant to have 300,000 people on it. As I talked to you, it's got 750,000 people on it. Most of them are kids with these sort of mild disorders getting packages worth tens of thousands of dollars a year. So in some cases, parents struggle to spend that much money, and it's a disaster. It's sucking all the money out of the care economy as well as the rest of the budget. So at the same time, you've got old people waiting for a $20,000 home care package, and they're on waiting lists of years. And the NDIS is just hoovering all the money. It's grossly inefficient, it's grossly unfair, and it needs to be fixed.
And the other spending announcement last week was lifting the deeming rate on pensions?
Yes, which was a good thing to do. I mean, if you're a pensioner, you're probably saying, no, it wasn't. But a deeming rate is, if you're on a pension or a welfare payment and you've got assets, and not your family home because that's exempt from the assets test, but you've got an investment property or you've got money in the bank or something else, you're earning interest or income from those assets, rather than every person on a pension reporting how much they get from those assets, the government just applies a rate. That's called the deeming rate. They deem you're making X amount of income, and they use that to calculate your pension. And what happened during COVID is the Morrison government lowered that deeming rate to emergency levels. As we came out of COVID, as interest rates started to go back up, Labor came into government and they kept the deeming rate at emergency low levels because of the cost of living crisis. What was significant last week is that Tanya Plibersek, the minister, announced that that's over. The deeming rate was going up by 0.5%, and what she said was the first of a phase up back to more normal rates. And that was significant, Lisa, because that statement also had a line saying, I'll paraphrase, basically you don't need it anymore because interest rates are back under control. So to me, that was a very strong sign from the government saying the cost of living assistance era has come to an end.
And one other thing that Treasurer Jim Chalmers is looking at, and it did come out of the discussion from the roundtable, was this idea of a road user charge to make up for the declining petrol excise revenue as more people buy electric vehicles. Not everyone agrees how that should work. What type of scheme do you think they'll come up with? Is there any indication? And is it a good idea?
Well, I'll start with the second question first. Yes, and this has been, I think Ken Henry was the first one to sort of really recommend it. So what it is at the moment, Lisa, when you fill up your car, whether it's petrol or diesel, you pay 51 cents a litre in tax. That's what the excise is at the moment, and that gets lifted by inflation every year. Let's say you fill up your car, costs you $100, you've just given the government $25 in tax. If you then drive 600 kilometres on that tank, you've basically paid 4.1 cents per kilometre in tax. If you have an EV, you pay nothing. The fuel tax raises about $17 billion a year, and ostensibly it is used to build roads and maintain roads. Now, if you're driving an EV, you contribute nothing towards the roads you're driving on. So it's a fairness issue, it's an equity issue, and the first serious attempt at doing this came back in 2016, 17, 18. Malcolm Turnbull was Prime Minister, and all the experts were saying, mate, you've got to get on with this because the later you leave it, the more difficult it's going to be politically because there's going to be more people driving EVs. They're going to be organised into lobby groups. They're going to complain that it's a tax on clean cars and all those, lines. And you're going to have a massive hole in your budget. So the sooner you can introduce one of these, phase it in, make it part of the furniture when you buy an EV, the easier it will be. But Turnbull was so paranoid about his leadership and instability at the time, he called off the whole thing, and so nothing happened. Labor got in, they were a bit too scared to touch it in the first term, but Chalmers recognised to his credit that it had, they had to grasp the nettle on this, so he gave it to the states through the National Cabinet process, and it sort of died there. But one of the advantages of this summit was that it was a chance to sort of rekindle it. It was probably the one thing in the Productivity Summit that had the most support. Like everyone said, just get it done. Because what happened, the states got so sick of waiting for the Commonwealth to take a lead on this that Victoria introduced its own. But as we know, under the Constitution, states can't levy taxes. Someone challenged that in the High Court in 23 and that died. New South Wales still has one. They have legislated a road user charge. I think it's 2.8 cents per kilometre for an electric, 2.3 for a hybrid. That starts on July 1, 2027, or when 30% of new car sales in New South Wales are electric. Now, that's now an effective deadline for the Commonwealth to act because if you can't have New South Wales going it alone, basically. So Chalmers, they've got the ball rolling out of the summit last week to do one of these things. What will it look like? Chalmers said it will only apply to electric vehicles and I suspect hybrids. Everyone will have an electric car eventually, right, without doubt. So the whole idea of bringing in an EV road user charge is that as petrol cars become obsolete, you seamlessly transition to a new system that generates revenue to fix roads. So the Treasurer said on Sunday, we're not double taxing motorists. We're not bringing in, there won't be this one size fits all for everyone regardless of how the car's powered. It will be, as this was originally envisaged, it will apply just to EVs and as time goes on and people get rid of petrol and diesel cars, then that's how it works. And I think that's the sensible way to do it. So before the round table, Jim Chalmers was saying the government was going to take its time and not rush this road user charge. But then at the round table, he announced that he and the state treasurers, his state counterparts, will be meeting on Friday next week, September 5, to start discussing options. So there's clearly a desire to get on with this. And at the same time the Treasurer will be doing that, the Prime Minister will be lifting his horizons, Lisa, but once more to the international stage and taking off soon to the United States, where he may or may not get a meeting with Donald Trump.
We're talking about the first 3 months of the Albanese government's second term. The Prime Minister is yet to meet with US President Donald Trump. The opposition has tried to raise this as a black mark for the government, Phil, even though such meetings for other world leaders have been quite fraught. Albanese might get his chance next month when he heads to the US. How important will this first meeting be?
If it happens, Lisa, and there's absolutely no guarantee that it will, the importance of it will be actually it happening, because there's now so much anticipation about this occurring. So as we know, the Prime Minister has yet to meet Trump. He's one of the few world leaders who hasn't.
Donald Trump's swift departure means his high-stakes meeting with Anthony Albanese is off.
We just can't crack a meeting with him. We look like the odd ones out when we go to these meetings. You're pushed off to the side, you don't get in the room.
Look, we'll have meetings with President Trump, a number of events over the coming months. We're about to enter summit season.
The view within government is it actually sort of hasn't hurt, because most people who have met Trump have come off second best. And when it came to those trade sanctions that they finalised a few weeks ago, we did better than anyone else in the world. So, in that sense, it hasn't really set us back. But there is a keen awareness in the government that they need to meet. It's a box that has to be ticked. The Prime Minister does need to get into Trump's ear about the AUKUS Pact. As you know, AUKUS is being reviewed at the moment by the United States, so it just pays to put your case leader to leader, all those sorts of things. So while it may not have hurt us not having a meeting so far, they're acutely aware they do need to talk to this fellow at some stage. So we're talking sort of grand final week, late September. The Prime Minister will head to the United States. He's going to the UN in New York to speak to the United Nations General Assembly, where Palestine and so forth will be a big issue. But they have also requested a White House visit, and as I speak to you, there's still no word on that. So at this stage, it doesn't look likely. And I suspect if Trump doesn't meet him at the White House, he's probably not going to get a one-on-one with him in New York either. That would then kick things on to October, where the Prime Minister goes away again for the APEC summit in Korea and the East Asia summit in Malaysia. In normal times, the US President would be at APEC. That's the next opportunity to meet him. If it doesn't eventuate there, the third and probably last chance of the year will be at the Quad Summit in India in early November. Now, there's no guarantee that's going to go ahead because Modi and Trump are fighting over tariffs and relationships are pretty poor. There's just no manual for dealing with Donald Trump. I mean, the guy doesn't follow the rules of the conventions or the orthodoxies that govern, bipartisan relationships, especially in foreign affairs. The view within government is that he's not hostile towards Australia. He just doesn't really feel a need to speak to us because he's so distracted on other things like Ukraine and the Middle East. It's a lot more volatile at White House than it was in his first term. I mean, there's that famous anecdote that Peter Harcher from the Sydney Morning Herald first reported that when Trump lost that election in 2020, Scott Morrison sort of said, thank God that's over, because he and Turnbull before him had to navigate that White House for 4 years. Remember they managed to secure exemptions on tariffs on steel and aluminium and some other things. And, Joe Hockey turned himself inside out as the ambassador trying to deal with that White House. Well, this time round, they're even nuttier. The sort of what they call the sensible people that were in that White House were all gone. It's just Trump and his acolytes. So it's even more difficult this time. This is not coming from government, Lisa, but my sort of firm belief is that they've taken a view, just got to survive the next 3.5 years. Stay on the bucking bronco, and not get thrown off.
Yeah. But this week, Phil, no one was talking about Trump. Everyone was talking about Iran. We had the first post-war expulsion of an ambassador after ASIO found Iran directed at least 2 anti-Semitic attacks on Australian soil. What's the level of concern about this in Canberra?
I mean, it was interesting listening to the press conference. The head of ASIO, Mike Burgess, stressed these are the 2 we know about. We think there's others. The question they're not answering, and I did ask this of Penny Wong, is what broader influence is Iran having in Australia, fomenting a lot of the community unrest?
ASIO has now gathered enough credible intelligence to reach a deeply disturbing conclusion.
The bombshell was that Australia was expelling the Iranian ambassador and listing the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist organisation.
I've said many times that the Australian people want 2 things. They want killing in the Middle East to stop, and they don't want conflict in the Middle East brought here. Iran has sought to do just that.
And this was in response to confirmation by ASIO that the Iranian government had been directly responsible for at least 2 anti-Semitic attacks on Australian soil, one being the Continental Kitchen in Sydney and the other one, the arson attack on the Adas Synagogue in Melbourne.
Mm.
But look, Iran's been on the radar, on ASIO's radar for a long time. They're right at the top of the pile with the Chinese and the Russians in terms of interference, political interference, espionage, threatening their expatriate communities who live here. Like they're really bad actors. It's not like this was came as some huge surprise, to be honest, to anyone in the intelligence community. But once you can actually, be satisfied beyond doubt that there's a direct link between criminal or terrorist behaviour and a state, a state-sponsored act, that makes it fairly black and white in terms of what action to take.
And Phil, this strong action against Iran comes just a week after Benjamin Netanyahu lashed out at Albanese. He called him a weak politician for recognising Palestinian statehood. Australian diplomats have been expelled from Israel. The relationship's at a very low point. How do you think the government is handling that relationship?
I mean, the view within the government is what Netanyahu did last week, and don't forget he also similarly lashed out at the French, the Canadians and the British, because we are operating in concert with them, very deliberately so, in terms of Palestinian recognition and our general approach to this situation. So the view within government was why it was not preferable for Netanyahu to say or do what he did, including the expulsion of the diplomats. They do see it as a sign that the pressure is getting to him, the global pressure is getting to them over the way Israel is conducting itself in Gaza, that it's lost the sort of moral high ground that it had after October 7, 23. So, how are they handling it? I think that's a subjective question. I think they're doing all right. I think they've done as well as they could have. No, you're not going to make either side happy no matter what you do. The people in the middle of this have always been the Palestinians. Hamas cares about them as little as the Israelis do, and they're really the victims here. And I think there's been that's been lost in all this, including by the government. But in terms of trying to send a message or be a responsible player, I think it's made sense to team up with like-minded democracies. Progressive nations like the French, the Canadians and the British, they're all similarly minded leaders and governments, and so we're hunting in a pack to try and minimise any fallback on us.
Phil, back on domestic politics, bearing in mind that you've said there's no way the opposition can win the next election.
Well, I caveat that. Never say never, but it's very unlikely, yeah.
Okay, well, bearing in mind that it's unlikely the opposition can win the next election, what's your assessment so far of Susan Lay's performance as opposition leader?
Oh, she's done a lot better, I think, than anyone thought she would. In those early days when the Nationals decided they're going to leave the coalition, that was a petulant sort of exercise in the way she held her dignity and stared them down and got them back in. earned her enormous kudos in her party, even amongst those people who didn't vote for her. Look, she's got an impossible job. Opposition leader, Lisa, as they say, is the toughest job in politics. I can't remember anyone having such a tougher job as this. As you said, she's presiding over this diminished party. There's only 27 Liberals in the lower house, only which 3 are women, right? The rest are Nats. The moderates are being wiped out. The Nationals won't rest until they destroy what's left of the Liberal Party. Into this, they're on this net zero crusade again. Everything that's reduced the Liberal Party to the rump it is now has come from either the right side of the Liberal Party or the National Party, and they are not changing course. So she's got to try and rebalance the party's appeal in all this, and net zero is just going to be the big blow up when she finally decides to confront it. But I think other than that, she's doing pretty well, trying to drag the party back to the centre, appeal to women. What have they got? 3 out of 77 metropolitan seats in the whole country. It's just such an onerous task. I make no exaggeration. I think the Liberal Party is suffering an existential crisis at the moment, and it's her job to try and sort of reverse that. I think one of the things going for her is being the first female leader of the Liberal Party. That buys her an element of time. If the right wants to drag her down, you'd want to think twice. You can't boast about having a female leader and then knocking her off in 12 months. Yeah, and I think just the low expectation, Lisa, that she'll ever be Prime Minister also gives her a nothing-to-lose type advantage. So it's all against her, but she's not going to die wondering. That's Susan Lee's motto.
Okay. So then a final question. As you say, a good opposition makes good government. So is the weak opposition at the moment more of a danger or an opportunity for the Albanese government?
Look, it's both, and Albanese is smart enough to know that. The last time we came close to a government having this sort of ascendancy was when Howard won the Senate in 2004 and vanquished Mark Latham's Labor. Yet he lost a term later because he didn't have an off switch. And in this case, when Albanese warns against hubris and exceeding his mandate, he actually means it, because Labor's biggest enemy is Labor. If they just get carried away, they could undo this pretty easily. There's no resistance in the Senate that Labor had last term. This is the best Senate any government's had since Howard won the Senate. They can basically do whatever they like in the next 3 years if they so choose, and so they're going to have to be very judicious. At the same time, there is opportunity, enormous opportunity for this government, because it has a long time frame now to work with. If it is going to be in power for 6 years, it can actually do some longer term things, some more ambitious things, but it's still going to have to just be mindful that it's not getting away from what it took to the last election in terms of mandates.
Thanks, Phil.
No worries.
Thank you for listening to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray, with Financial Review political editor Phillip Coorey joining the podcast today. The Fin is produced by Alex Gow and Mandy Coulin, with assistance this week from Iona Rennie and Zach De Silva. Fiona Buffini is head of premium content. Our theme is by Alex Gow. If you like the show and want to hear more, follow us wherever you get your podcasts, and consider rating and reviewing us as it helps others find us. For more stories about markets, business and power, subscribe to the Financial Review at afr.com/subscribe. See you next week.
The Australian Financial Review.